So before we can really talk about port scanning, first we need to talk about ports. Every device that's connected to a network, including the internet, uses ports to communicate. Now you may be thinking, wait a minute, I thought the devices use IP addresses to communicate. And if you said that, you would also be correct. They do use IP addresses, but they also use ports. You see, an IP address identifies a specific device on a network. Pretend that's a phone with me. Phone. It identifies a specific device on the network. A port number, on the other hand, identifies a specific service or application on that device. So it's kind of like the IP address gets you to the building, like the device, and then the port number gets you to the correct room, like the specific service or application that you're trying to communicate with or access inside of that device. So each port is assigned a number between 0 and 2 to the 16. So that would be 65,535. So we have ports between 0 and 2 to the 16. And different services typically use specific port numbers. So for instance, port 80 is usually used by HTTP. Port 22, that's usually SSH. SSH is Secure Remote Login. Port 43 is usually HTTPS, and 53 is famously DNS. Okay, so ports are not just connections. They are not connections. It's really important for us to understand that. They're more like entry points for creating connections. So for instance, you could think of, let's talk about port 80 in this case. You could think of it as like a receptionist at a company. Every time someone calls the company, so let's say someone opens a browser tab, the receptionist, port 80 in this case, because we are using HTTP, is going to pick up and start a conversation. In this case, it would be a TCP connection. And then that connection is then handed off to someone else to handle. And then that leaves our dear friend, the receptionist, port 80, ready to take the next call. Whenever you send data to a computer over the network, you are going to send it to some destination IP address, right? To some IP address and to some destination port number, just like that. So for instance, I could say like just a random IP address, 0.5, let's call that the IP, 80, okay? So what this is saying is, hey, send this to the web server, HTTP, because I'm using port 80 on this device. And what's going to happen is that the operating system on the device is listening for incoming connections on specific port numbers. And it's going to route the packets to the correct applications based on the port number. Now, incoming packets, they're going to arrive at the device's IP address. Then what's going to happen? The operating system is going to check which port number they're for. And then what is it going to do? It's going to pass it to the service or application that is listening on that port. Now, one last thing I believe that I need to tell you about ports. There are 3 main port ranges, and each of those port ranges has a different purpose. So if we start with port 0 to 1023, these are well-known ports. These ports are reserved. Specifically, they are reserved by INA, the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority. And these are for standardized ports. So for instance, port 21, right? Because that's going to be used for FTP, File Transfer Protocol, or port 22, which we talked about, which is going to be used for SSH, or port 80, which is used for, do you remember? HTTP, exactly. Okay, so these are reserved. Applications that use these ports typically need to be trusted, and often they require administrator or root privileges in order to be able to bind to these ports. Next, we have ports. Can you see that? Okay, next we have ports 1024 all the way up to, let's see if we can get it written. Okay, 1024 all the way up to 49. There we go. So 49,151. Now these ports can be registered by software vendors for their apps. So these ones are semi-reserved. They're not hard-coded standards, but being mindful of them can help to prevent conflicts. So for instance, port 3006 is typically for MySQL databases, or like port 5432 is typically for Postgres SQL, right? But you are free to use these for internal services. Just be careful because there might be conflicts. And then our last group is our dynamic. Our last group is our dynamic or ephemeral ports. Dynamic or ephemeral. I keep looking down to make sure I'm writing properly. Ephemeral ports, and that is literally just port the remaining ports all the way to 635. Okay, now these are used temporarily by the client side of a connection. So when your browser connects to a website on port 80, your system is going to use an ephemeral port, like, I don't know, port 49,152 as a source port. The operating system is responsible for assigning these dynamically, and then they're going to be released when the connection ends. So let's do an example. So let's say your browser needs to connect at, why can't I read? Let's say your browser needs to connect at port 80. So it needs to connect to some server's IP address at port 80. 192, whatever. Let's pretend that's the IP address, okay, at port 80. Now, what your computer is going to do is it's going to select an inferior port. So let's say it selects port 49,321 as the source port. Now, so what's going to happen is it's going to form a connection like this. So you have your IP address, okay, and then that port number that you use, your source port, and then that's going to go over to the server's IP and their port, which in this case is 80. So the server is then going to say, hey, okay, I'm the server. Here's my server IP on port 80, and I'm going to send back data to your IP at port, this source port that you used to send me information, at port 49,321. And then once that session is over, the ephemeral port is released and it's free to be used for other things. Now, ports really matter because they enable multiple services to run on the same machine. So ports are going to ensure that we have proper routing of incoming and outgoing traffic. This is going to be really important when you are trying to configure firewalls, when you're running servers, when you are performing security audits, when you're analyzing network traffic, all sorts of things. It's also really important from a security standpoint because open ports can be exploited if the services running on them are unpatched or if they are misconfigured. So port scanning is going to be really, really important, which is what we're going to talk about in the next video, because port scanning is going to be used by attackers and defenders to identify any exposed services. So we can also, firewalls, that's what I want to tell you about, firewalls. Firewalls can also allow or block traffic based on the port number. So for instance, you can say, I want to block all traffic except for port 443. All right, thanks for watching.